Way back in 1776, the United States of America was born with 13 states that all sat up on the eastern coast of the country, and in 1804 France sold the Louisiana Territory to America. The 13 states established by the USA had a government and a constitution and law and order. And it was the land further to the west that would become known as the Wild West, an untamed land that was vast and barren, just waiting to be explored and claimed. It was rich in silver and gold that was just waiting to be discovered. It was also home of many Native American tribes that were brandished savages by the very people that invaded their home and way of life. As the years passed, settlers started to explore further afield, deeper into the west to find their fortune and start a new life. It was an exciting time. It was a time of prosperity, of new beginnings in the Promised Land. Unfortunately, it was also a time of hardship and of danger in a land that had no real law and order. The risk of Apache raids were constant, and when the settlers were not fighting with the local native tribes, they were fighting amongst themselves in a time where whiskey and bad tempers went hand in hand, and a problem could always be solved with a loaded gun. It was in this time that a certain outlaw was introduced. He was said to have killed 21 men, that's one for every year of his life. He was a torment to some and a hero to others, and he went down in history as one of the Wild West's most famous cowboys. He is better known as Billy the Kid. And his story just isn't that straightforward, as Billy didn't go looking for a life of crime. The crime, more or less, came looking for him. Before we go any further, I would just like to let you know that I will be referring to Billy the Kid as simply the Kid. He had a few different name changes throughout his life, and I'll refer to those name changes as they come up. But for the most part, I'll refer to him as the Kid, which was what he was actually called by his friends. He was only known as Billy the Kid in the final year of his life. Early records show that the Kid was born Henry McCarty and was brought up in the slums of Manhattan or possibly Brooklyn with his mother Catherine McCarty and his younger brother Joseph, and life was hard and rough for the small family who did what they could to make ends meet. Now, Catherine wasn't actually from America, she was actually an Irish immigrant, and she fled Ireland during the potato famine that was responsible for so many deaths, which prompted many to try and make it across the sea to America's shores, to make an attempt at a better life in a country that wasn't exactly inviting to the Irish and the Catholic religion. Catherine may have been married to a Michael McCarty or a Patrick McCarty, but historians cannot be 100% sure of this. But if she was married at some point, then her husband either left her or died. That is, if he even existed in the first place. It's entirely possible that McCarty was a maiden name. Henry McCarty, the Kid, was said to have been born on September the 17th, 1859, or on November the 20th, 1859, in the Irish slums of New York, and a few years later his younger brother Joseph was born. One thing we need to know about Catherine before we go any further was that she was a proud woman. She wasn't going to let the fact that she was alone in a strange country, living in the disgusting conditions of the slums without a penny to her name, keep her down. And she also wouldn't allow the fact that she was seen as a dirty Irish immigrant in so many people's eyes hold her back. She was a go-getter. She had great ambition, and the slums simply couldn't hold her for long. In 1865, she is known to have been in Indianapolis in Indiana with her two sons, and it was here that she met Bill Antrim, who worked for an express company, and a romance soon blossomed and they became a little family. And by 1870, Catherine, Bill and her two sons had left for Wichita, Kansas. And it was here that Catherine actually opened up her own laundry business in town, and things were actually looking promising. She had actually done it. She had brought her little family up from the slums and was now somewhat successful, and she could hold her head up high. Now, they were not making a great deal of money. In fact, the Kid would often be remembered in later years as a polite and friendly street urchin, so times still must have been somewhat tough. After a while, the family could at last afford a small plot of land where the Kid and Uncle Bill built a small log cabin, a nice modest little home that they could be proud of. So you may be surprised to hear that by 1871 the family had once again moved away from their newfound security, leaving everything they had built behind. But why? Well, sadly, Catherine had been diagnosed with tuberculosis, or as it was commonly known, consumption, a fitting word for an illness that was in those days a death sentence. And so Catherine probably needed to seek out a better, drier climate for her ailment, and they eventually landed in New Mexico, which was much better for Catherine's condition, but was also a very volatile place to live. It was well known for the many different cultures that didn't see eye to eye, and for the many settlers that came from far and wide with very little on their mind but making their fortune by any means necessary. It wasn't completely lawless, but the law in that time wasn't up to much, and the place was rife with heavy drinkers and itchy trigger fingers, and conflicts were always solved by taking a life. That was simply the way of the West. Now, Catherine, who knew that she didn't have long left in this world, decided that she wanted to get married before the consumption literally consumed her. And she may have also wanted to make one last effort to secure a life for Henry and Joseph. So, in 1873, in Santa Fe, Catherine and Bill were wed, and she and her children took Bill's last name. The kid was now known as Henry Antrim. And it wasn't long before once again they were on the move. This time their journey took them to Silver City in New Mexico, which was aptly named due to silver being found in the 1870s. It was in Silver City that the Antrims set up home. Bill Antrim worked odd jobs here and there, whilst Catherine took in boarders to make a little more extra money. It was in Silver City that the kid attended school and was once again remembered for being a polite young man who was always happy to help with chores. On the whole, he was a charming but ordinary child who loved to read. He could occasionally be found with his nose in a good dime novel, reading about some of the highest adventures from some of his favourite fictional characters, blissfully unaware that he would one day be the star of many a book. However, all chances of the kid living a happy, ordinary life came crashing down on September the 16th, 1876. It was on this day that Catherine Antrim succumbed to her illness and passed away after being bedridden for 4 months. Catherine left this world thinking that her sons would be well looked after by the man who took her hand in marriage. Unfortunately, Bill Antrim had very little interest in bringing up 2 boys who he hadn't fathered, and after Catherine died, he had very little time for the 2 brothers. Bill Antrim would constantly leave the 2 boys alone for long periods of time, whilst he was out looking for his fortune, leaving them in the care of Mr. Richard Knight, who ran a butcher shop and a ranch, and the kid was more than happy to help out here and there in the butcher shop, and was said to be very mannerful and helpful, which seems to be a common opinion of the kid, it seems. Records show that he also liked to sing and dance, even performing in the opera house, and of course, it's also well known that the kid liked to whistle a tune or two. But the kid's innocent ways were soon challenged when he decided to steal several pounds of butter. The kid, who had just lost his mother, was probably looking for a way to make ends meet. Remember, not only had his mother passed, but he'd also been abandoned by his only father figure, and so without a role model to look up to, it's no wonder his venture into crime started with something so minuscule. Now, butter in those days was a luxury and brought a pretty penny, so the kid took a chance and stole the butter from a rancher named Webb and sold it on to a merchant. This wouldn't go unnoticed, and the kid was caught for his petty crime, and he was held by the local sheriff, who actually had no interest whatsoever in punishing the kid for his crime. The sheriff simply wanted to scare him into behaving. The sheriff felt it was a mistake by a good kid who had gone through some hardships, and eventually he was released with no consequence. However, the kid didn't seem to learn his lesson, and it wasn't long before once again he was in trouble. The kid's further descent into a life of crime came when he started a friendship with a George Schaefer, better known to the locals as Sombrero Jack. Sombrero Jack was a bad influence on the kid, but in the kid's eyes, he was his closest friend, and he stuck close to him like glue. Unfortunately, Sombrero Jack was a drunk and a thief, a relentless thief, and one night he had a plan to rob the local Chinese laundry, and he wanted the kid to help him. Sombrero Jack stole a bundle of clothing, which the kid hid under his bed in his current boarding home that was owned by a Mrs. Sarah Brown. She found the clothing and reported the kid at once to the Sheriff Whitehill. Once again, the kid was in trouble with the law, while Sombrero Jack had simply fled the area, leaving the kid to take the blame. Now, this time the kid was actually kept behind bars, in a manner of speaking. You see, once again, the sheriff didn't wish to come down hard on the kid. He was actually given multiple chances to do the right thing. The sheriff even allowed the kid to have the run of the hallway instead of being trapped inside the cell. But this trust was misplaced in the kid. One day, the sheriff returned to the jailhouse, unlocked the door, and entered only to find that the kid had vanished. It seemed impossible at first, but then the sheriff noticed that the kid, who was quite skinny, had managed to climb up the chimney to his freedom. Freedom that most likely would have been his if he had only stayed but a little longer. The kid, now on the run, had no one to turn to, apart from one man, his stepfather Bill Antrim. who he called upon in Clifton, Arizona. Even though Bill Antrim didn't have much interest in the kid, he didn't turn him away immediately. He did let him stay a night or two, but that was it. He made it clear that he couldn't stay with him longer than that, and so the kid up and left, but not without stealing a few provisions and maybe a pistol. A few months later, records show that the kid arrived in Camp Grant, which was within the Arizona Territory. It was a military post, and the kid found work as a cook in the Hotel de Luna, and also worked at the Hooker Ranch. And this is where the kid learned multiple skills when it came to handling horses, riding, roping, and other mundane tasks that would ultimately add to his expertise. It was an honest living, and the kid really did enjoy this work. But unfortunately, the kid was let go from his employment, and once again, he turned to a life of crime, this time rustling horses. Now, in those days, stealing a horse was a very serious crime, and in some areas it was punished in some very severe ways, if you were caught. This included a whipping and the removal of the thief's ears, and sometimes the horse thief would have the letters HT burned onto their forehead, forever branding them a horse thief. And a horse thief was seen as the lowest of the low. Now, the kid had made friends with a John R. Mackey, a Scotsman who had actually served in the army. That is until he shot a man in the neck after an argument over a card game. He was lucky that the man he shot didn't die, and he was released after claiming self-defense, but he was also discharged from the army. At some point, John R. Mackey and the kid had become friendly and discovered a much easier profession that didn't involve washing dishes, and that was becoming a horse thief. Now, the kid and Mackey became quite good at it actually, always on the lookout for a soldier who tied up the horse outside of a saloon. Once the soldier was inside enjoying a drink, the kid and Mackey would be stripping the horse of its saddle and blankets, and sometimes they even took the horse. Soldiers became so concerned that the horse would go missing whilst they enjoyed a drink that they started to tie up the horse with an extra long rope that they took into the saloon with them. Of course, this didn't stop the kid, who simply cut the horses free as Mackey distracted the soldiers with conversation. However, the kid would steal a horse that belonged to a Sergeant Lewis C. Hartman whilst the sergeant was inside a store. The kid made away with his ride, and Hartman was furious and determined to bring him to justice. They tracked the kid down and recovered the horses, but somehow the thieves got away. An arrest warrant was issued for the kid, but he was nowhere to be found. That is until one morning in March 1877 when the kid and Mackey were seen wandering into a hotel dining room for breakfast. It was a Miles Wood who served as Justice of the Peace who made the arrest in a remarkable way. As the kid sat down to eat, Wood stopped the waiter and told him he would wait on the kid. He took the tray from the waiter and proceeded to the kid's table, and before they could order, he pulled out a six-shooter from underneath the tray and pointed it at the kid and Mackey and ordered them to reach for the sky. The kid was held at Fort Grant, and as we know now, he was actually quite good at escaping. His first attempt didn't go exactly to plan. After throwing salt into a guard's eye and trying to make a run for it, he didn't get very far before being wrestled to the floor. And because of this escape attempt, Miles Wood had the blacksmith shackle the kid to ensure any further escape attempts would be futile. Unfortunately, it would seem that Miles Wood somehow underestimated the kid's yearning for freedom, and upon returning, he found that somehow the kid had escaped. Even shackled up, it would seem that he couldn't be held. This would mark the second time that the kid had escaped the law, and it wouldn't be the last. The kid fled the area, and an arrest warrant was sent out for the kid's capture. Twice he was arrested, and twice he somehow slipped away, and this would be a familiar trait. Months had passed, and the kid actually returned to the area of Camp Grant with his six-shooter stuffed down his trousers, with not a worry in the world. That night, the kid settled down in a local saloon. Also, in the same saloon was Camp Grant's blacksmith, the same blacksmith who had actually made the shackles for the kid whilst being held prisoner. The blacksmith was called Francis P. Cahill, but most knew him by his nickname, which was Windy. He was named Windy due to the fact that he was a loudmouth who liked to talk, and he was also a bully. The Irish-American troublemaker's attention seemed to be concentrated on the kid more than anybody else. The kid was well liked. He was said to be very charming, and the people seemed to gravitate towards him. This may have been the reason why Windy had started to pick on the kid whenever he got the chance. He would mess up the kid's hair, slap him about, and even knock him to the floor. Anything to humiliate the kid in front of everyone. But there was only so much the kid could take. Yes, it's true, the kid was a charming person, polite and pleasant, but he also had a fiery temper that was growing inside of him more and more by the day. And on that night, with a belly full of whiskey, Windy took it one step too far and called the kid a pimp. And in retaliation, Billy called Windy a son of a bitch. Windy saw red and knocked the kid to the ground, falling upon him with his crushing weight, pummeling the kid's face with his fists. The sheer weight of Windy kept the kid pinned to the floor, helpless, and as the blows kept coming, the kid groped for his pistol. He pulled it from his trousers and pressed the muzzle of the gun into Windy's stomach and pulled the trigger. A deafening bang rang out in the saloon, and Windy crumpled on top of the kid, bringing down all his weight upon him. The kid then squirmed his way out from underneath of Windy, covered in his blood. The kid wasted no time and darted from the saloon and jumped upon the nearest horse he could see and rode for his life. At this point, Windy was still alive, but gut shot, a death sentence. And unfortunately for Windy, he didn't slip away peacefully. He lasted the night in agony and died the very next day. Upon Windy's death, it was decided that due to Windy not drawing a weapon, the shooting could not be justified. There was a chance that if the kid wound up in court, he could plead his case, maybe be set free by claiming self-defense. After all, Windy was a bully, an imposing brute compared to the kid's skinny frame. And then there was the witnesses that saw Windy constantly abusing the kid. But the kid was running scared, and he rode as far away as he could from the hand of the Arizona law. He spent 2 weeks at the Richard Knight Ranch, the family who looked after Billy and his brother back in Silver City when his mother died. But the kid didn't linger. He was afraid the authorities would catch up with him sooner or later. And so he fled, never to return, and his destination was Lincoln County. The kid was now wanted for murder. Suddenly his previous crimes of stealing a few pounds of butter and a bag of laundry and being a horse thief were now the least of his sins. He had killed a man, and Lincoln County seemed like the best place to hide away from his troubles. Little did he know Lincoln County would only add to his troubles tenfold. John Tunstall was an English-born man who arrived in Lincoln County ready to make his fortune. He'd already partnered up with a Scottish-Canadian lawyer named Alexander McSween, who was in contact with a Mr. John Chisholm, who had a massive ranch and held over 100,000 heads of cattle. Alexander McSween had made it abundantly clear to Tunstall that there was money to be made in Lincoln County, which was still on the rise, and John Tunstall wasted no time in setting up his own cattle ranch some 30 miles from Lincoln County. As well as this, he had also opened a mercantile store in Lincoln Town. John Tunstall intended to make his fortune out here, and as far as he was concerned, no one was going to get in his way. Unfortunately, John Tunstall did have some fierce competition. From a Mr. Lawrence Murphy and his protege James Dolan, Irish immigrants who had also come to Lincoln a few years back and had already established themselves as the head honchos in most business affairs and ruthless cattle barons. And the arrival of John Tunstall, who also wanted to make a profit, did not sit well with them. Now, the law in the town did exist, but it was at its best a very weak system, and Dolan and Murphy more or less ran the town, and they had the local sheriff William J. Brady in their pocket, as well as the courts. Dolan and Murphy also owned a store in town, an opposing building, the only building at the time with 2 floors, and this structure was called the House, and every bit of business concerning the town went through them. It was John Tunstall's aim to be just as successful as Dolan and Murphy, and he was adamant he would be. Unfortunately, he did not quite grasp the dangerous waters that he was wading into. Dolan and Murphy were ruthless, and they would not hesitate to do whatever they needed to do to put John Tunstall and Alexander McSween out of business. And whilst Tunstall believed that the pen was mightier than the sword, Dolan and Murphy knew that the gun was mightier. But before violence was used, Murphy and Dolan would first try intimidation. In 1877, the kid had joined a gang of outlaws known as the Boys, a ruthless gang of no-good cattle thieves. The leader of the gang was a young man named Jesse Evans, who had actually worked for Chisholm, the main cattle provider in Lincoln, and had become quite good when it came to controlling cattle, almost to the point rustling cattle. He later found work on the ranch of John Kinney, who was 5 years older but shared a similar outlook on life. Both men were ruthless and just as violent. Kinney wasn't a regular part of the Boys, but his ranch was sometimes used as a safe haven. At this time, the kid still had his stepfather's name, Henry Antrim, but now he was an outlaw, and that name just wouldn't do anymore. And so he changed his name to William H. Bonney, or Billy Bonney. And the kid was actually becoming very good with a pistol, and it is said that the kid was not a heavy drinker, and the Hispanic women loved him, so much so that his money was very rarely spent on saloon girls. But one thing he did spend his money on was bullets. He loved to practice firing his gun at becoming the best shot he possibly could. Even from horseback, he was accurate with a pistol and a Winchester rifle. The boys were a ruthless gang who didn't think twice about riding into a settlement and shooting it up, and if you spoke against them, they would surely retaliate, and they took whatever they wanted, whether that be in booze or goods. The boys were also in the pocket of Dolan and Murphy, the cattle barons, who enlisted the boys to steal cattle for them, which they bought at a very cheap price to be sold at a much higher percentage. Dolan and Murphy could employ the boys to do whatever dirty work they needed in order to keep their names as clean as possible. On one occasion, the boys had stole horses from the ranch of Mr. Richard Brewer, and some of those horses belonged to John Tunstall. And for some reason, the kid had chosen to sit this one out. It's believed that his heart wasn't entirely into being a member of the gang, but they were all he had at the time. Richard Brewer, the ranchman, was not willing to let this rest and insisted that Sheriff Brady lead a posse of 15 men to find the horse thieves. Eventually, the posse closed in on the boys, led by Evans, and arrested him and 4 other men and placed them in Lincoln jail. It wasn't long before the boys rode out with 30 or more men, including the kid, to Lincoln jail to free their leader, Jesse Evans. When they arrived, they found one lone guard at his post, possibly arranged by Sheriff Brady, who had been told to do so by Dolan. And it didn't take much persuading, just a gun to the head, and the guard surrendered, as the boys used rocks that had been conveniently placed next to the prison to smash the locks in with and free their leader. It wasn't long after that the kid actually left the gang. It's possible that he had made other friends, or he just wasn't comfortable with that way of life. Whatever the reason, it was only a couple of months before Billy found work, and that work was a little more honest, and it was working for the Englishman John Tunstall, whose feud with Dolan was heating up. Dolan had now more or less taken over the reins of the house from Lawrence Murphy, who was now getting on in years and had taken to drink. Dolan's intimidation tactics didn't seem to be making much of an impact on John Tunstall and Alexander McSween, who were also determined to make a living even if it meant taking some of that business from Dolan, and Dolan could not let that stand. Tunstall and McSween were not violent men, but Tunstall understood that not everything could be fought with legalities, and even though he wasn't well known for wielding a gun, he wasn't against the idea of hiring men to wield the guns for him. Just as Dolan had acquired himself a large gang of hired guns with the boys, John Tunstall had done the same. It's true, he needed good workers for his ranch, but he also needed men who could fight for him if needed. And because of this, his men were paid a supplement, you might say, for the risks that they have to take. Essentially, paying for ranch hands that provided protection. And the kid was the latest recruit. The kid liked his new employment, and he was grateful to John Tunstall for employing him, and he had a great deal of respect for the man. Now, in many of the movies that have been made about Billy the Kid, John Tunstall is portrayed as a father figure to Billy, someone who took him in and gave him security, when in reality the kid probably only met Tunstall a handful of times when he wasn't away attending to other commitments. But that does not mean that the kid did not respect John Tunstall and was not grateful for the opportunity to have some honest work. Well, somewhat honest. And even though the kid was involved in the very gang that plundered Tunstall's cattle, John Tunstall had still seen fit to give him a job, and the job seemed to change the kid in some respects. The kid joined Tunstall's other employees, and there were many of them, but the names that you will constantly hear crop up are the following: 26-year-old Dick Brewer, who was a foreman for John Tunstall, 29-year-old Charlie Bowdry, and Doc Skurlock, a family man who was said to be an excellent marksman, and 23-year-old John Middleton, a soft-spoken gentleman with a fearsome attitude, and 19-year-old Henry N. Brown, who was only a year older than the kid, who also had worked for the Murphy-Dolan side and had left over a dispute of wages. 25-year-old Fred Waite, a part Indian educated man who fast became one of the kid's closest friends, and Frank Coe and his cousin George Coe, and the kid mixed in well with his new pals. John Tunstall intended to make his fortune with his ranch and mercantile store, but it wasn't going to be an easy thing to accomplish due to the house ran by Dolan having a stranglehold on most of the area. Dolan held contracts to supply the town and army with supplies. If you wanted to buy, you had to go through the house. The house was also heavily involved in the very shady Santa Fe Ring, which was basically a group of crooked businessmen and politicians who become rich through running fraudulent land deals, as well as corruption and murder. The Ring more or less ruled the New Mexico territory. The house was in deep with shady dealings and ruthless ways, and they would sell land to farmers that they didn't actually own in the first place, and obtain contracts to supply to the Native Americans living in the area, and the food supplies were often left short, and the Native Americans were given spoiled food. And of course, when the complaints came rolling in, they were simply ignored, as the complaints went directly to politicians or attorneys that were directly involved in the Santa Fe ring. So, going up against Dolan was a very dangerous thing to do, and it was well known that the house was run by dangerous men, and Alexander McSween and Tunstall were warned on many occasions that if they continued to try and compete with the house, with Dolan, then they would walk a dangerous path that would end in blood. Now, it is dramatised in some places that Tunstall just wanted to start his own business to free the people from the tyranny of the house and Dolan and Murphy, when in fact this probably wasn't the case. It's true that Dolan's prices were daylight robbery, buying stolen cattle for $5 a head and then selling them for 3 times the cost. And he was the main merchant in the area, so he could charge people the highest prices and know that they would pay. But to say Tunstall was an angel in all of this probably wasn't accurate. He wasn't there to bring down the house for the greater good of the people, but he had actually stated in a letter found by historians that he intended to make a high profit. And his intentions were most likely to see the empire that Murphy and Dolan built crumble to the ground, but for his own benefit, not for the good of the people. But was he the greater evil in this story? No, I don't think he was. I think that definitely goes to Dolan. But that isn't to say that Alexander McSween and Tunstall were angels, because they most definitely were not. The bloodshed that was to follow was most likely prompted by a life insurance claim that was being handled by lawyer Alexander McSween. This client was actually an old business partner of Alexander Murphy named Emil Fritz, and $10,000 worth of life insurance money was to be handed over to the heir of Fritz. But for some reason, McSween refused to hand over the money, probably fearing that the money would go directly to Dolan, which may have been a very accurate assumption considering that Dolan had managed to get McSween charged with embezzlement. And the judge ordered a formal written order that allows Sheriff Brady, the corrupt sheriff that was in Dolan's pocket, to form a posse and legally claim enough of McSween's property to cover the $10,000. McSween's home was raided for items of value. Unfortunately, with Tunstall being partnered up with McSween, the posse also invaded Tunstall's store, believing that the property of the store belonged to both of them. It didn't. Over the next week, Dolan's cowboy gang was sent with another formal written order to impound McSween's cattle, which was actually Tunstall's cattle. In the end, Dolan's hired guns departed without the cattle after being warned by Tunstall's men that they could not take the cattle and they were prepared to fight for it. On this occasion, the Tunstall men must have had the upper hand, and Dolan's hired guns decided to head back home to gather more men. A few days later, Tunstall and some of his men, including the kid, were riding for Lincoln, with them 9 horses that Tunstall was trying to keep out of the hands of Dolan's men, who were at this point, may I add, deputized. So they were working as the law. Tunstall had brought with him 4 men, which included the kid, as well as Dick Brewer, John Middleton, and Robert Weidenman. Now I'm going to try and set up the scene for you. Middleton and the kid were about 500 yards behind John Tunstall, Brewer and Weidenman as they approached the top of a hill in the distance. Brewer and Weidenman spotted some wild turkey just off the road and rode off, rifles at the ready, hoping to catch some dinner. At that very moment, a large posse of Dolan men, 15 strong, including Jesse Evans, a man named Billy Morton, and another man named Tom Hill, approached Tunstall, firing their weapons in the air as they rode. Middleton and the kid rode as fast as they could towards Tunstall. Middleton was in the lead. As John Middleton approached, he yelled to Tunstall to follow him to cover, but Tunstall looked confused. John Middleton called out again with desperation in his voice as the posse got closer, and John Tunstall, who still seemed confused by all the gunfire, simply called out, "What, John? What?" Then it was too late. Jesse Evans, Billy Morton, and Tom Hill all unloaded their weapons into John Tunstall's direction, and the bullets flew. One hit him in the chest and one in the head, and John Tunstall fell from the saddle, dead. As soon as Tunstall's dead body hit the dirt, another bullet was discharged into Tunstall's horse, killing it. The posse decided not to take on the remaining Tunstall men, who had found suitable defensive cover, and the posse fled. Tunstall was found with his gun beside him with 2 empty chambers. Billy Morton, who was deputized and led the posse, claimed that Tunstall had fired 2 shots, and in self-defense, him, Jesse, and Tom shot back and killed Tunstall. John Tunstall's men didn't believe this for a minute. You see, the posse were there to collect Tunstall's horses, but Tunstall's body had fallen dead slightly off the trail, away from the horses. That meant that the killers would have had to ride past the horses and headed directly for Tunstall and then killed him. No, this was murder and there was no doubt about it. The day after, Tunstall's men rolled back out and collected Tunstall's corpse. The body was later taken back to Lincoln and laid out on a table in Alex McSween's house, awaiting embalming. The kid entered the room and walked up to the dead body of Tunstall, and while staring down at his ex-employer's body, he uttered the following words: "I'll get some of them before I die." With Tunstall's death, it was the start of what has now become known as the Lincoln County War. Alexander McSween was devastated when he learned that his friend had been murdered and he wanted vengeance, but McSween was not a violent man in the slightest. He preferred to fight using the law. Unfortunately, the law seemed to be one-sided, and that side was firmly on Dolan's side, who had Brady in his pocket, and he also had the backing of the Santa Fe ring. But all was not lost. There were two other lawmen that Alexander knew who he could turn to, who also despised the tyranny of Dolan and the House. So McSween sought out the help of Constable Martinez and Justice of the Peace John B. Wilson, and it wasn't long before warrants were issued for the apprehension of 5 outlaws and 12 members of the posse that killed John Tunstall, and they also had warrants for Sheriff Brady and 5 of his men, who still held Tunstall's store. But Sweeney had found a legal loophole that could get Brady and his men out of the Tunstall store, and that was to charge them with larceny. After Brady sold some hay to soldiers that belonged to Tunstall and not the county. And it wasn't long before the now McSween faction made their first move. The Kid and Frank Waite, now deputized, bravely followed Constable Martinez to the house to issue these warrants. You're probably thinking, why would only 3 men walk up to the house and brazenly present the warrants? Well, this was actually a decision to avoid bloodshed. McSween had hired a lot of men to help bring down the Dolan faction, but to send a gang of men would most definitely have ended in death. Although I'm not saying sending 3 men was a wise idea, but I can understand their thinking. So the Kid, Frank and Constable Martinez entered the house only to find many rifles aimed directly at them. Constable Martinez produced his warrant and started to shout out the men's names upon it, but he was quickly silenced. Sheriff Brady had absolutely no intentions of handing over any of his men, and as far as he was concerned, he was the only law in Lincoln. And the Kid, Frank Waite, and Constable Martinez were quickly stripped of their weapons. After a few hours, Martinez walked from the house, weaponless, but the Kid and Frank Waite remained as Brady's prisoners. The next day, Tunstall's funeral was held, whilst the Kid sat behind bars. Brady would eventually free the Kid and Frank Waite, who walked away without their weapons or their pride. The Kid's weapon that Brady took was actually a Winchester rifle that had been given to him by John Tunstall, which of course held some sentimental value to the Kid. So, Constable Martinez had proven unsuccessful and was clearly out of his depth, and so McSween decided that his posse needed a new leader, and that responsibility went to Dick Brewer, Tunstall's foreman, who was now appointed special constable, and the warrants were now passed over to him, and he was determined to bring the murderers to justice. And with that, the posse was named the Regulators, and this deputized posse, which included the Kid, meant business, and they were determined to make the Dolan faction pay for the murder of John Tunstall. Now, the Regulators actually ranged from about 10 to 30 men, and before the end of the Lincoln War, it would reach 60. The Kid rode with the main core group and was included in every operation carried out by the Regulators, and they all took an oath that was called the Ironclad, and this oath was to not bear witness against anyone in the Regulators or divulge their activities. One of the warrants held by Dick Brewer, the leader of the Regulators, was for Billy Morton, one of the gunmen that killed Tunstall in cold blood, and it wasn't long before the Regulators found them riding with 5 other men along a stream named the Rio Penasco, and all of a sudden, a chase broke out. Eventually, the gang of cowboys split into 2 groups. The Regulators chose to follow 2 riders and let the others escape. Luckily, Morton was the one of the 2, and the other man was named Frank Barker, who was also on the warrants held by Dick Brewer. Eventually, Morton and Barker's horses collapsed in exhaustion, and the 2 men scrambled for cover as the Regulators closed in. After a brief standoff, Dick Brewer gave his word that if the two men surrendered and gave them no trouble, then no harm would come to them. And so the two men surrendered, and the regulators started back to Lincoln with their prisoners. On the journey back, the regulators bumped into a man named William McCloskey, who was a regulator but was also friends with Morton, the prisoner who participated in the killing of Tunstall. Now, remember, it wasn't all cut and dry. People swapped sides regularly. And if you remember, it wasn't that long ago before the kid actually rode with the enemy. So this wasn't an unusual thing to happen. So even though McCloskey was now a regulator, he was still friends with Morton, and so he decided to ride back with the regulators to ensure that Morton wasn't murdered along the way, and that he faced justice for his crime instead of being executed. Now, the regulators knew that Dolan's men could well be out looking for them, so they decided to take the prisoners along a different route off the main road and through a trail called Blackwater Creek through the Capitan foothills. It was on this route that the regulators claimed that Morton grabbed McCloskey's pistol and shot his friend dead, and then Morton and Barker tried to escape, and the regulators opened fire on the two men, killing them both. At least one of these bullets came from the kid's pistol, placing another notch on his belt. Now, this was the official story given by the regulators, but it is believed that Morton, Barker, and even McCloskey were simply executed by the regulators, who may have believed that McCloskey was a spy working for Dolan. But when it comes to it, we will never know what actually happened in Blackwater Creek. But whatever happened, the facts were that 3 men were dead. Meanwhile, back in Lincoln, Dolan was visited by the New Mexico governor Samuel B. Axtell, who decided that the regulators had been wrongly granted authority to enforce the law. Dolan also knew the United States District Attorney, who had investments in the House. So of course this was just probably more corruption, and the House using the power of the Santa Fe ring to get what they needed. The governor took the side of Dolan and wouldn't even entertain an explanation from the other side. This meant that the killing of Morton and Barker and McCloskey was now murder. Sheriff Brady was now the one true law in Lincoln, and he had his own warrants for the regulators. McSween and the regulators had plenty of reasons to hate Sheriff Brady. Some of the regulators had had run-ins with him in the past and were not treated in the best of ways, including the kid and Frank Waite, who had been abused and insulted by him and his men whilst taken prisoner. For the last few weeks, the regulators lay low, avoiding attention the best they could, whilst McSween and his wife Sue had been hiding out at John Chisholm's South Spring Ranch. In March, some of the regulators, including the kid, paid a visit to McSween to plan out their next steps. It's true that they were not exactly the law anymore, but as far as they were concerned, they were, and they intended to bring the Dolan force to justice. The only problem was the Dolan side believed the exact same thing. Both sides thought they had the right. Both sides thought they were the law. Now, I've said that McSween wasn't a violent man, but maybe he had no problem in paying someone to pull the trigger for him, because it is believed he may have decided that Sheriff Brady needed to die. In records after the fact, it was noted in a statement that he did offer a reward for the death of Brady. Whether this is true or not is unclear. But it was believed that Brady was the one who sent the posse to kill John Tunstall. On March the 31st, under the cover of night, a small group of regulators placed themselves behind the Tunstall store in Lincoln Town. At around 9 o'clock in the morning on April the 1st, Sheriff Brady walked from the direction of the Dolan store. With him was his deputies, Billy Matthews, George Heineman, George Pepin, and John Long. When the sheriff approached the Tunstall stall, the regulators sprang their trap and appeared from behind the wall, and riddled Sheriff Brady with at least 12 bullets, ripping him to shreds. Meanwhile, one of the bullets hit Heineman, killing him, whilst Pepin and Long ran for cover. Whilst over in his garden, just as the piece, John Wilson received a bullet directly to the buttocks. Actually, the bullet passed straight through both cheeks. When the shooting had stopped, the kid, accompanied by his fellow regulator, Jim French, leapt at the wall and ran over to the body of Sheriff Brady, and the kid retrieved his Winchester rifle from the corpse, which showed a certain amount of recklessness. Across the street, Billy Matthews, one of Brady's men, took aim from the window of a house and fired. The bullet ripped through the kid's thigh and then straight through into Jim French's thigh, and once again, the kid's rifle was lost as he dropped it to the ground to hobble back to cover. The killing of Brady was definitely a personal act. They made no attempt to make an arrest. They simply started shooting, slaying him in the street. It was definitely an ambush. It was almost too easy, and now with the killing of a man of the law, the heat on the regulators and McSween had definitely been cranked up a notch. Around 2 days later, a small band of regulators arrived at Blazer's Mill, which was located on a hillside between Lincoln, New Mexico and Tularosa. The area consisted of a large 2-story house, a large square office building that was attached to the main house, a sawmill, and a grist mill. The house belonged to a gentleman named Dr. Joseph H. Blazer, who had leased this property to the government and allowed an Indian agent named Frederick C. Godfroy and his wife to call it home. Mrs. Godfroy was known to take in lodgers and cook them a warm meal, and that's exactly what the regulators had in mind. A man named Andrew L. Roberts was also on his way to Blazer's Mill. Andrew Roberts was his birth name, but in these parts he was better known as Buckshot Roberts, who had a part in buffalo hunting and may have also come in contact with some Texas Rangers, which resulted in a round of buckshot being unloaded onto his shoulder, thus giving him the name Buckshot Roberts. The injury made it hard for Roberts to raise his right shoulder up high, so his shooting was done from the hip, but this didn't hinder him in any way. The man had a very accurate aim, and deadly when he wielded a pistol or a rifle, and the regulators were about to find this out the hard way. Now, Buckshot Roberts wasn't there to take on the regulators, he was actually there to collect a check for the quick sale of his ranch, and the reason for this quick sale was due to the warrant that Dick Brewer had for Buckshot Roberts. You see, Roberts was actually part of a sub-posse responsible for killing John Tunstall, but it is believed that Buckshot Roberts wasn't involved directly with the killing of Tunstall and unlikely he would have even participated. However, the regulators held a warrant for him, and the word was going around that the regulators executed the prisoners, especially the one who was known as a kid, William H. Bonney. So naturally, Roberts didn't want any trouble and wished to leave the area as fast as possible, but he couldn't leave until he had collected the check for his ranch. After all, it was his livelihood. He had arrived on his mule at Blazer's Mill before the regulators had, and was dismayed to find out that the mail carrier had not arrived. He was advised that the regulators were in the area, and to avoid conflict, he decided to leave Blazer's Mill and return later. He took a mountain trail to avoid the main road, but upon doing so, he noticed a mail carrier in the distance, heading for Blazer's Mill. So Buckshot decided it was worth the risk, and he turned his mule around and headed back for his check. Unknown to Buckshot, the regulators had just arrived at Blazer's Mill and were already inside whilst Mrs. Godfroy prepared them food, and they had hidden their horses behind a high fence, so Buckshot Roberts assumed it was safe to proceed, and upon his mule he made his way towards the house. Unknown to him, 14 regulators sat inside. Regulator John Middleton stood watch, and when Buckshot Roberts approached and stated his name, John Middleton went inside to inform the others. Dick held the warrant but sent out fellow regulator Frank Coe to talk to Roberts due to Frank actually knowing Roberts personally. Frank Coe went out and requested that Buckshot surrender. Buckshot at this point had taken his holster from his hip and hung it on his saddle, showing respect to the owner of the mill who didn't want any gunfights at his place, but he did keep his trusty Winchester rifle by his side. The two greeted each other near the office attached to the house, and all was well and somewhat calm, but Buckshot refused to surrender due to the fact that most prisoners of the regulators wound up dead, and Roberts knew the kid was present and probably had an itchy trigger finger. Once again, Frank Coe tried to reassure Buckshot that this wouldn't happen and he should hand over his rifle and he promised no harm would come to him. This went on for a half an hour. Dick Brewer, who remained inside, was getting more and more impatient and sent 3 men out to force a surrender: John Middleton, George Coe and Charlie Baudry. As the 3 men rounded the corner, Charlie Baudry yelled at Buckshot to throw down his rifle, and with that, all hell broke loose. Buckshot brought his Winchester up to hip level, and both Charlie and Buckshot pulled the trigger at the same time. Charlie's shot rang out and punched a hole into Buckshot's stomach, whilst Buckshot's bullet hit Charlie's belt buckle, knocking the wind out of him and sending his gun belt falling to the ground. The bullet also ricocheted off the buckle, blowing away George Coe's trigger finger. Buckshot started firing off rounds as fast as lightning. Even mortally injured, he was a force to be reckoned with. As he backed up into the office building, he sent a bullet smashing into John Middleton's chest. Doc Scurlock had also joined the fight, and Buckshot fired a bullet from his rifle that hit Doc's holstered gun, which redirected down his leg. All the regulators had now joined the fight, jumping for cover from the rapid fire of Buckshot. The kid appeared and almost met the same fate as John Middleton, but managed to jump for cover. And then the firing stopped. Guessing that Buckshot Roberts had ran out of ammo, the kid charged the wooden office that Buckshot had fortified. The kid thrust his Winchester into the door and pulled the trigger, but not before Buckshot smashed the muzzle of his empty rifle into the kid's stomach, which sent the bullet into the door frame, missing Buckshot. and with this, the kid retreated to find cover again. Meanwhile, Buckshot had made his way into the next room with blood pouring from his wound, and discovered a single-shot Springfield rifle on the wall and a box of shells. He then dragged the mattress from the bed and barricaded the door, lay down and aimed the rifle outside, ready for any regulator that may come his way. Now at this point, Dick Brewer, the leader of the regulators, was absolutely furious at how this had escalated. Dick scrambled to some logs nearby and positioned himself behind them, and from here Dick had a perfect shot at the doorway to the room where Buckshot had took refuge. Dick pointed his weapon and fired. The bullet missed Buckshot completely and buried itself into the wall behind him. But now Dick had given away his position, and Buckshot, who must have been in agony but still insisted he wasn't going down without a fight, rested his rifle on the mattress he had blocked the doorway with and simply waited. It wasn't long before Dick popped his head up from the logs long enough for Buckshot to make his mark. He squeezed the trigger of his Springfield rifle and the bullet blasted out of the weapon on a collision course for Dick Brewer's left eye socket, blowing the back of his skull out. As Dick's dead body hit the ground, the rest of the regulators left Roberts alone. They figured he was going to die anyway from his wounds, and none of them wanted to wind up dead. Apart from Dick Brewer, none of the regulators lost their lives that day. Even John Middleton, who got shot in the chest, went on to live another 6 years. Buckshot, however, died the day after, suffering throughout the night. 2 coffins were put together, and Buckshot and Dick were both buried side by side behind Blazer's Mill. With Dick Brewer now dead, the regulators needed another leader, and Frank McNabb was next in line. A new sheriff was also elected, John Copeland, who held warrants for the kid and a few more regulators. The embezzlement charge for McSween had been dropped, and he decided he would now head home. And for some time, the regulators actually made the McSween house their meeting place. You see, the regulators felt somewhat at ease, considering the new sheriff was somewhat lenient on them. Meanwhile, Dolan was plotting his next move, setting up a new posse. At some point, the regulators' new leader, Frank McNabb, Franco, and a man named Ab Saunders was ambushed by this new posse, and McNabb was shot and killed. Saunders was also shot and died later, and Franco surrendered and was taken prisoner. And so the regulators now elected Doc Skurlock as leader, and they were determined to remain a pain in Dolan's side, and they still had outstanding warrants to serve, void or not. The only problem was Dolan still had his warrants for the regulators. It was truly a crazy situation. On one particular night, the regulators invaded a Dolan cow camp and stole 25 horses and 2 mules, and scattered the herd. They also captured the camp cook, who was apparently the killer of their previous leader, Frank McNabb. The cook was taken prisoner, and at some point he tried to flee, but the kid and a fellow regulator pulled their pistols and brought the camp cook down, dead. The invasion of Dolan's cow camp may have brought more heat down upon the regulators and McSween. You see, Dolan had actually gone bankrupt by this point, so the cattle didn't actually belong to him anymore. They belonged to a man named Thomas B. Curtin, who in turn made the situation known to the governor Axtell, who started up a whole new investigation into this feud. Dolan also found a way through some legal technicality to pass the sheriff badge from Copeland to George Pepin, one of Dolan's men. This was not a good thing. Copeland seemed to favour the McSween side of the war, but George Pepin was totally loyal to Dolan, and easily directed by Dolan, he had warrants for the kid and other regulators for the murder of Sheriff Brady and the murder of Buckshot Roberts, even though the kid wasn't actually the one to murder Buckshot Roberts. And once again, the regulators and McSween went into hiding from the Dolan posse and even the military, and the two sides clashed a few times here and there with no major bloodshed. However, McSween had grown tired of this constant running and hiding and simply decided to go back home to Lincoln and let fate decide what happens next. On July the 14th, the regulators joined him and placed themselves on rooftops and inside certain buildings in Lincoln town. It was time to bring this war to an end. McSween returned to Lincoln with 60 men. Sheriff Pepin and Dolan and a few men all congregated at the Waterloo Hotel across from the store Dolan once owned. You see, during the whole war, Murphy and Dolan were actually going through some hard times business-wise and had been declared bankrupt. As the regulators entered Lincoln with their 60 men, Pepin and Dolan knew they were miserably outnumbered. They had a posse of around 40, but that posse was out searching the countryside, probably looking for the regulators. The regulators placed themselves between the McSween house and on rooftops of a few other buildings, and the kid took his station at the Montano store. In the afternoon of July the 15th, 1878, Pepin and Dolan's posse returned to Lincoln, reined their horses at the Waterloo Hotel, and as soon as they dismounted, it wasn't long before they opened fire on the McSween house. Seeing that McSween was under fire, the kid and around 10 other men abandoned their stations and ran towards the McSween house to help Alex and Sue, his wife, and Sue's sister and her 5 children who was in the house with him. At first, hardly anyone retaliated because no one wanted to risk losing men. Dolan had less men on his team, but the regulators were spread out over various buildings, so in a sense, each group of regulators in each building were outnumbered if Dolan chose to attack just one building. But how could they advance without being shot down by the regulators? There were a few injuries from stray bullets that were fired now and again, striking the 2 factions involved and local citizens alike, innocent citizens. One of these bullets broke through the window of the McSween house, killing a man named Tim Cullens, and another bullet found its way into the neck of a local feeding a mule. On July the 16th, just as the sun was setting, 2 of the regulators noticed a solitary rider approaching. They took aim and fired, and the rider fell from the saddle. Then he clambered to his feet and ran directly to the Dolan headquarters. Unfortunately, the rider was a military cavalryman with a message for Dolan. Dolan had asked the army for a howitzer, and the man in charge, Colonel Dudley, refused, not wanting to involve himself or the army with a law matter. Unfortunately for the regulators, they had just shot at a soldier, and that was a big no-no. More soldiers were sent the very next day to investigate, and once again the regulators opened fire upon them. And with that, the military entered Lincoln, officially to protect the public, but when it came down to it, they sided with Dolan and his forces. They didn't look fondly on the regulators who had shot at the officers. On July the 19th in the mid-morning, the regulators watched as the army marched down the street led by Colonel Dudley. There were 4 officers, 11 troopers of the 9th Black Cavalry on horseback, and 24 white footmen of the 15th Infantry, and they also brought with them a howitzer and a rapid-fire Gatling gun. The colonel insisted he was neutral in the matter, even telling Sheriff Pepin that if any of his posse injured his men, he would blow them above the clouds. The colonel may have insisted he was neutral, but his actions said otherwise. He insisted he was there to protect the innocent, whilst inside the McSween house were 2 women and 5 children, and he never interfered or tried to ensure their safety. And it wasn't long before he had the howitzer in front of the Montano store and unleashed hell. The regulators inside fled to the Ellis store to join the rest of their men, but the colonel simply moved the howitzer and started shooting at the Ellis store. The men inside the Ellis store had no option but to flee the town and retreat. They made an attempt to re-enter, but the army had a Gatling gun aimed on their position, and Dolan's men also had the area covered, so to do so was suicide. Now Dolan's men, along with the military, seriously outnumbered the kid and the remaining regulators that were inside the McSween house. Reluctant to open fire upon the soldiers, the regulators now found themselves in a tough spot. Well, tougher than before. Certain posse members had advanced on the house and had started to pull down wooden shutters from the house and break down the barricades the regulators had built. They were getting ready to set the house on fire, even though there were innocent women and children inside. In a last-ditch effort to end this without violence, Deputy Marion Turner shouted that he had warrants for the arrest of McSween. McSween answered that he also had warrants of his own to serve to the Dolan posse, and he wasn't going to surrender. And when the deputy requested to see the warrants, Jim French, one of the regulators, shouted from a window, "Our warrants are in our guns, you cocksucking son of a bitches." And with that, negotiations were over. Sue McSween left the house to beg the colonel to help them to save her house and her husband, but the colonel refused to get involved with a law matter. A short while after Sue returned to the house, it was set ablaze, the fire hopping from room to room. Sue's sister and her 5 children fled next door to the Tunstall store through a side entrance, unseen by the men outside, and it wasn't long before Sue joined them. Back in the burning house, McSween was a broken man. He could see that he had already lost. As his world burned to the ground, he sat with his head in his hands. But the kid was alert and wild, and he knew now that McSween was broken, he needed to take the reins and come up with an escape plan. The kid, who was normally quite happy to be led, now became the leader. The kid was now in charge. He grabbed McSween and brought him to his feet, telling him they're going to make a break for it. It was now pitch black, and the posse men were all around the house. Escape was going to be tough. The only route they could take was out the back door, into the yard, and up into the hills. The house, now totally ablaze, forced the remaining men into the northeast kitchen, and even though flames lit up the night, for some reason the yard was still pitch black, perfect to disappear into. They all fled into the yard and up the side of the Tunstall store, heading for the trees, but But of course, it wouldn't be that easy, as some of the posse noticed them and opened fire, killing a regulator named Harvey Morris whilst 4 other men made it into the darkness of the trees. McSween and the remaining men were forced back and took cover where they could, some against a wall and some in the chicken house. They were trapped, and whenever they tried to make a run for it, the bullets from the posse tore up the yard and they were forced back. After a little while, McSween called out that he would surrender. When 4 members of the posse approached, it would seem that this was a ploy, as McSween defiantly shouted, "I will never surrender," and with that 4 posse men riddled McSween with bullets, and the remaining regulators also opened fire in a last-ditch attempt to escape. One of the Dolan's posse men received a bullet to the eye, killing him instantly, whilst 2 other regulators fell dead beside McSween, as the others and the kid managed to escape along with some that were held up in the Tunstall store, and they fled. The war was over. McSween was dead, and although Dolan, still vengeful, was bankrupt, there was no real winner. But through this loss, the kid had become more weathered, more experienced, and gained a little more fame from the whole ordeal, appearing in newspapers around the territory. But the kid's story was far from over. After the Lincoln County War, what was left of the regulators didn't disband. There were now about a dozen of the regulators left. These men had spent the past 5 months fighting back to back, and the remaining men had a great deal of respect for the kid, and at this point he was more or less the leader, steering the regulators in whatever direction he saw fit. Officially, Doc Skurlock was still the main leader, but the responsibility was kind of split between him and the kid. After the battle at the McSween house, they had been left with no horses, so they turned to horse theft, and in no time they were back upon their steeds, or new steeds. Even though the war was kind of over, there was still a lot of hostility between the 2 factions, and Sheriff Pepin, fearing for his life, went into hiding at Fort Stanton. On August the 5th, the regulators Bonney, Skurlock, Middleton, Baldray, Brown and French stopped off to see Dick Brewer's grave, who had been shot down by Buckshot Roberts at the Indian Agency, and they were riding with around 10 Hispanics. The core group of regulators, including the kid, broke off the main road and headed towards the spring to get a drink, whilst a Hispanic group continued on the road towards the Indian Agency. Before they reached the agency, they had bumped into a group of Indians and a gunfight broke out. At the Indian Agency, there was a gentleman named Bernstein who was busy giving out rations to the Indian women when he heard a commotion, and quickly jumped onto his horse and rode out to try and stop the fight. When Bernstein arrived at the battle, he was shot dead by one of the Hispanic regulators, most likely by mistake. However, when his body was later found, it would seem that he had been shot 4 times and his pockets emptied and his weapons taken. It could have been the regulators who did this, or it could have been the Indians, it wasn't clear. But the facts didn't seem all that important, as the murder of Bernstein was pinned on the kid, even though he had been over by the spring drinking when the gunfight started. I think at this point, the life that the kid was living was just about losing its appeal. In some ways, he liked the notoriety, and in other ways he didn't, especially having to watch his back constantly, and because of this, he fled Lincoln for a short time. It would seem like most of the other men in the regulator started to feel the same way, and slowly the men started to go their own way and get out of New Mexico whilst they could. But defiantly, the kid chose to stay. But one of the regulators stayed with the kid, a Tom Folliard. Tom Folliard admired the kid. He had met him during the Lincoln County War and had fought side by side with him. Wherever the kid went, Tom was sure to go. He kind of looked up to the kid. He would often stand outside waiting on the kid as he met with a girl, and this could have been up to an hour or all night, but Tom would wait on his friend. And now, with the disbanding of the regulators, it was mainly the kid and Tom riding together, constantly looking over their shoulder. Meanwhile, Sue McSween, Alexander McSween's wife, was determined to bring the Dolan faction and Colonel Dudley to justice after the destruction of her house and the murder of her husband. And to help her do this, she had hired a gentleman named Houston Chapman, who was a one-armed lawyer. There had also been a new governor elected, Governor Wallace, and he knew all too well the state of affairs in Lincoln and wanted the whole situation to come to an end, and he offered a general pardon to all involved in the Lincoln County War. However, if the individual had been indicted, then no such pardon would be granted, and the kid was indeed under 2 indictments for murder. When February rolled around in the year of 1879, the year after Tunstall's death, the kid had finally had enough of fighting and wrote a letter to the Dolan faction requesting a parley, and with that the 2 factions met in Lincoln and agreed to make peace. On Dolan's side there was Dolan himself, Matthews and Jesse Evans, the kid's old acquaintance, the leader of the gang Billy rode with before switching sides. His enemy, who was a little unhinged and actually wanted to shoot Billy on the spot. This heated confrontation cooled and the 2 sides decided on peace, and an agreement was made that neither side was to testify on the other or kill each other, and with that the pact was made and a party was started right there in the street. However, the peace wouldn't last for long. Dolan had a new member on his group called Billy Campbell, who was known to be an opposing man, cruel with a short fuse. Also in the area that night was Houston Chapman, Sue McSween's new one-arm lawyer, who was also fighting a terrible toothache and had his face bandaged up, so you can imagine he must have been easy pickings for a bully such as Campbell, who at once stood in Chapman's way and demanded his name. Once Chapman revealed his name, Campbell pulled out a pistol and demanded the lawyer dance, wishing to humiliate him in front of everyone. Chapman then asked if he was talking to Dolan. That's when Jesse Evans decided to get involved and told Campbell that he wasn't talking to Dolan but a damn good friend of his. At that moment, Dolan, who was standing behind them, pointed his pistol into the air and shot off a round, which in turn apparently startled Campbell, and his trigger finger jerked and shot the lawyer point blank in the chest. The lawyer spoke his last words, which were, "My God, I am killed," and then fell to the ground dead, as the killer simply walked away and entered the nearest restaurant for supper. Dolan and Campbell then instructed the kid to go back outside and place a pistol into the dead lawyer's hand to make the killing look like self-defense, and fearing for his life, the kid took the pistol, and as soon as he was outside, he jumped onto his horse and fled the area, implicated in yet another murder, when all he wanted to do was make peace. Even though the kid had just taken an oath not to testify against the Dolan faction, it would seem that with the shooting of the lawyer, Mr. Chapman, the circumstances had changed and he no longer felt safe or even trusted that Dolan would keep his word. And so, almost a month later, the kid wrote a letter to Governor Wallace which said the following. "I was present when Mr. Chapman was murdered and know who did it. If it was arranged so, I could appear at court and I could give the desired information. But I have indictments against me for things that happened in the late Lincoln County War, and I'm afraid to give up because my enemies would kill me. If it is in your power to annul these indictments, I hope you will do so as to give me a chance to explain. I have no wish to fight anymore. Indeed, I have not raised an arm since your proclamation. As to my character, I refer you to any of the citizens, for the majority of them are my friends, and have been helping me all they could. I am called Kid Antrim, and Antrim is my stepfather's name." When the governor read this letter, he actually agreed to the kid's terms, and by this time he already had Campbell, Dolan and Jesse Evans confined at Fort Stanton, and no one was willing to testify out of fear, but the kid was. And so a deal was put together. The kid would testify and a fake arrest would be carried out to protect him against his enemies. As well as being ready to testify, the kid also told Governor Wallace the trails the outlaws took, hiding places and such, completely breaking the pact he had made in Lincoln only a month ago. And so the kid and his friend Tom O'Folliard took the stand and testified against Dolan, Evans and Campbell. So now with the deal completed, Billy should now be a free man. Unfortunately, the governor had left Lincoln and the judge of the case had no intention of letting the kid go. He would rather see him hang. But luckily, the new sheriff was well aware of the deal that had been made on June the 17th, and he turned a blind eye and allowed the kid to slip away into the night. Once again, the kid was on the run. After that night, the kid once again turned to horse theft with his shadow Tom Folliard and Charlie Baldry, along with a few other men, and at this time his notoriety with his fellow outlaws became more known and was respected and took the lead in many operations, but not entirely in charge. The kid mainly operated in Fort Sumner. This was due to the lack of law in the area, which made it easier for him to make a living stealing cattle. On one occasion in Fort Sumner, the kid and his pals were having some drinks and fun in a saloon, and it was in the saloon that the kid bumped into a man named Joe Grant, a brutish fool of a man who was steaming drunk. Earlier, he had made a $25 bet with the kid that today he would be the first to kill a man before the kid did, and Joe Grant was eager to make it a reality. The kid was interested in the challenge, but it may not have been to Joe Grant's approval if he knew who he intended to kill. Joe Grant drunkenly stumbled over to another cowboy named Jack Finnan, and he couldn't help but notice a very attractive ivory-handled pistol in his holster. Without not a word of explanation, Joe simply took Jack's pistol and replaced it with his own worn one. And Jack said nothing, as it was probably better not to antagonize a drunk bully who had intentions of shooting someone dead. The kid had been watching from afar and walked over to Joe, whilst remarking how nice Joe's brand new pistol was, and he took it from the drunk. Billy had admired the craftsmanship of the gun, whilst at the same time observing that only 3 of the chambers were loaded, whilst the other 3 held empty rounds. Before the kid handed it back, he ensured that the 6-shooter was lined up with the empty chambers and not the live rounds. Not long after this, Joe Grant spotted a man he believed to be John Chisholm, the cattle baron, Tunstall and McSween's business partner before the Lincoln County War, and Joe intended to kill him and claim his bet money of $25. But the man he intended to kill was not John Chisholm, it was John Chisholm's brother, and when the kid informed Joe that he had the wrong man, Joe accused him of being a liar. And with that, the kid simply turned his back to the drunk and headed for the exit. In a drunk rage, Joe pulled his fancy new pistol, pointed and pulled the trigger, and click. The hammer fell upon an empty round. And when the kid heard the click, he spun around like lightning, pulled his pistol, and unloaded 3 bullets into Joe's face, or more accurately, his chin. And Joe fell down dead. Even though this killing was 100% at the hands of the kid, the law didn't pursue. As I said before, this was the law of the West. If there was a confrontation and a fair fight, then the law would more or less turn its back. And it was indeed an unprovoked attack, and in the kid's defence, it was self-defence. Regardless, it didn't seem important enough to report, and the newspapers didn't really bother. It was simply another drunken dispute settled with a gun. Meanwhile, with all the horse theft going on, the victims formed the Panhandle Stock Association and at once seeked out a detective named Frank Stewart, along with 4 cowboys who were now on the search for the horse rustlers. As well as this, a man named Azariah F. Wild was sent by the US Secret Service, who believed that the kid and his associates were involved in counterfeit banknotes that were going around Lincoln. But once again, no one would testify against the outlaws out of fear of retribution, so a change was needed. First of all, 2 men were found to become deputy marshals. They were John Hurley and Robert Ollinger, who were both actually members of the Dolan faction that fought in the Lincoln County War. Wild was also responsible for assembling a 40-man strong federal posse to hunt down the counterfeiters, and to do this, they were instructed to find the cattle rustlers. Also, Sheriff George Kimball had to go. He would have to be relieved of his duty. After all, he couldn't be trusted. He was seen on many occasions enjoying a drink with the kid, and as we know, he turned the cheek and let the kid ride away from the jail, knowing that he had been treated unfairly by Governor Wallace. The man responsible for getting rid of Sheriff Kimball was ultimately John Chisholm, McSween and Tunstall's business partner. Now you might be wondering, why did Chisholm turn his back on the kid and the other regulators after being in business with John Tunstall and McSween for so long? Well, it turns out that the regulators were getting some kind of payment from McSween, and after the Lincoln County War, the money was running dry, and the kid and the regulators went to John Chisholm and requested more money or more rations, and John Chisholm just refused because, as far as he was concerned, he was not involved in the Lincoln County War, and because of this, a little bit of a rivalry was formed between the two, resulting in the kid actually pointing a pistol at John Chisholm, but in the end decided not to kill him. Instead, he decided to take his pay by stealing John Chisholm's cattle. So, as you can imagine, John Chisholm wasn't very happy with this, so he suggested a man named Pat Garrett should run for sheriff. A towering 6.5 feet tall Pat Garrett was an imposing character, and he was admired by Chisholm, who believed he was good with a pistol and as brave as they come. Garrett received 320 votes to become sheriff. The seemingly weak Kimball received only 179 votes, and with that, Pat Garrett was now the new sheriff. Meanwhile, it would seem that the kid had moved into a different kind of criminal activity when he and his pals robbed a US mail service that was full of letters stuffed with cash from soldiers sending their wages to the bank or home. It would seem that the kid was now leaning more and more into a life of crime and wasn't doing himself any favours. The kid was now on the run from 2 separate manhunts. Despite the kid's further involvement in crime, he still endeavoured for a release, and he had actually succeeded on making a deal with a lawyer named Leonard and Azariah Wild, who worked for the US Secret Service. The deal was that the kid would once again give evidence, this time against the counterfeiters, and he would get the same deal as before, the deal of a pardon, the deal he was cheated out of. And so an appointment was arranged, but the kid arrived a whole 6 weeks late, and by this time the deal had expired. So the kid simply carried on doing what he did best, stealing. The kid and his gang would later ride into the town of White Oaks to sell stolen cattle. As well as this, they also helped themselves to provisions from stores. But they failed to pay for the items, so they had officially outstayed their welcome. It was said that the kid was a friendly character and well liked, but if he wanted something, he would simply take it. Whilst visiting White Oaks, the kid and his gang would use a ranch called the Great House Ranch, ran by Jim Greathouse. This was a place the kid and his pals went to sell stolen cattle, and often a place to retreat to when needed. On one particular morning, an employee of the ranch stepped out to find a posse all holding Winchesters, pointing right at him. The employee of the ranch was sent back inside with a note asking the kid and his gang to surrender. This was met with laughter. However, the posse did have them trapped and they did mean business. Once again, the kid was trapped inside a house with a posse outside wanting to kill him. So negotiations were suggested, and with that, Jim Greathouse, the owner of the ranch, stepped outside to help with negotiations. But the kid wasn't happy with this, and in his place he requested the local blacksmith Jimmy Carlisle. As requested, Jimmy Carlisle entered the ranch with no weapons, and it wasn't long before it became blatantly obvious that Jimmy Carlisle had been taken prisoner. Whilst inside, the kid seemed to be in good spirits, but there was also a menacing undertone. And for some strange reason, the kid would constantly fill up the whiskey glass of Jimmy Carlisle, ordering him to drink. He knocked them back one after the other, and after a while, he was rather drunk to say the least. At around 2 p.m, the posse grew rather impatient and demanded the blacksmith's safe return or they would kill Greathouse. Barely 5 minutes later, someone fired their gun within the posse. This was probably just a misfire. But all of a sudden, a panicked man launched himself through the window of the ranch. It was Jimmy Carlisle, who had no sooner hit the ground when 3 shots rang out and Jimmy Carlisle fell dead. Apparently, when he heard the misfire, he panicked and made a mad dash through the window. Later, the kid insisted that the blacksmith was shot dead by the posse, whilst members of the posse claimed to have seen the kid lean out of the window and shoot the man dead. After Jimmy Carlisle was shot dead by whoever, the posse simply lost interest and departed, giving the kid and his pals time to slip away. I personally think the reason the posse left is because it was them who killed Jimmy Carlisle, thinking it was a kid launching himself out the window. Although saying that, one of the members of the gang that rode with the kid, Dave Rudebar, later claimed that he and the kid and another man called Wilson shot at the blacksmith and killed him. Unfortunately, still to this day, no one actually knows who shot Jimmy Carlisle. Now, to this point, the kid was somewhat admired by most in New Mexico, but with the death of Jim Carlisle, the blacksmith, that admiration became tarnished and the tables were turning. Going up against ruthless cattle barons and avenging the death of Tunstall was one thing, but this just seemed cruel and evil. In December of 1880, a lengthy article was published in the Gazette about the terror that the kid and his gang of 40 to 50 horse thieves inflicted on Fort Sumner and the surrounding areas. It was in this article that the kid was named leader of the gang, and it was here for the first time that the kid was given his official outlaw name that will go down in the pages of history. It was in this article that the kid was first named Billy the Kid. And it wasn't long before many other newspapers started using Billy the Kid in their headlines. In many ways, he was now a celebrity. He was no longer flesh and blood. He was now a character, a legend in the making, a villain. In some respects, the articles told the truth. There was around 40 to 50 outlaws terrorizing New Mexico and the surrounding areas, but they didn't operate as one whole unit. They would split off into different branches, and they were not all led by Billy the Kid. But the papers painted a different picture. A little freaked out by his newfound fame, the kid wrote once again to the governor begging to be heard. He claimed he was making a living gambling, he claimed he didn't shoot the blacksmith, and he also claimed he retaliated in self-defense due to the posse holding no warrants. The kid tried and tried to get across his innocence. How much was truth and how much was lies is hard to say. However, when the governor received this letter, he simply handed it over to the newspapers to print and make a joke out of it. Not only did the governor ignore his letter, he also put a price on the kid's head, $500 for his capture. Meanwhile, the new sheriff of Lincoln County, Pat Garrett, was working hard to locate the so-called ringleader, this Billy the Kid, using every resource at his disposal, including hiring spies here and there. Garrett was closing in fast. Eventually, Pat Garrett's investigations brought him to Fort Sumner, and because of Pat Garrett's presence in Fort Sumner, friends of Billy actually wrote him a letter and told him to stay clear. However, Pat Garrett enlisted a known accomplice of the kid who feared the kid more than admired him. Pat gave this accomplice instructions to write a letter claiming that Garrett and his men had left Fort Sumner and it was safe to return. And after that, Garrett and his men fixed up an ambush. The kid and his gang approached Fort Sumner around 8 p.m. that night. In the lead was a man named Pickett, and the kid shadowed Tom O'Folliard, who always liked to stick close with his friend. But on this occasion, he rode up front as the kid lingered with the rest of the gang far behind. All of a sudden, Garrett sprang the trap and shouted halt, and with that Tom reached for his pistol, but he wasn't fast enough as Garrett fired his Winchester, hitting Tom and spooking the horse, which bolted with its fatally wounded rider. Meanwhile, the other man, Pickett, managed to ride away safely. From afar, the kid witnessed the ambush and fled as the rest of Garrett's men opened fire. Meanwhile, Tom's horse trotted around, still holding Tom in the saddle. He had been hit in the chest, but still alive. Garrett asked his men to take him from the saddle and make him comfortable. He didn't live for long. He requested some water, and after that, Tom died. A short time later, snow fell on the land, a nice white blanket that made it so much easier to track horses, and with the help of more spies, Garrett did just that, closing in on the kid. After sleeping in the hills or at the Wilcox Brazil ranch, the kid decided that staying in one spot too long wasn't a good idea. What he didn't know was the owner of the ranch was also helping Garrett, giving him information. He was one of Garrett's spies. On December the 23rd at 3 a.m. in the morning, Garrett and his men tracked down the kid and 4 other men to an abandoned rock house near Stinking Springs, which was a very small one-room building with a low roof and open voids where windows and doors once occupied. Inside, the gang slept soundly as Garrett and his 23 men approached. They positioned men around the building and waited for the morning. A few hours later, the sun rose, and as it did, a solitary figure ventured out from the rock house carrying grain for the horses. Garrett was sure he was looking at the kid. This figure fit the description, and so he gave the signal. Suddenly, there was the awful sound of multiple rifles firing at once, shredding the man with the grain to bits, and he fell back into the building. The gunshot man was not the kid. It was Charlie Baudry, who had been part of the Regulators since day one and had become a friend to the kid. So this next part may seem a little strange. The kid told Charlie that he should go back out and kill some of Garrett's men before he died himself. And with that, he adjusted Charlie's gun belt and pushed him back out of the door. But Charlie was in no fit state to fight. He staggered towards Garrett, stated he was dying, and then did just that. Once again, the kid and his small gang were trapped as a posse of men waited outside to shoot them dead. Garrett looked up and noticed that the men inside the rock house were trying to pull in their horses to make an escape. But Garrett was determined not to let any of them escape this time. He took careful aim and shot the horse dead, and it fell in the doorway, sealing the exit, and the other horses were let loose. They were now trapped, but that didn't stop them from trying to escape. They tried digging the way out, but every time the posse outside noticed that they were trying to make their escape, they simply fired at the holes they were digging. They also tried to break through the actual walls of the building, maybe to stick their weapons out of and fire at the posse. But in the end, they failed to do so. And so a standoff started, with the kid and Garrett shouting to one another now and again. Garrett telling the kid to surrender, whilst the kid told him to go to hell. The gang knew they were trapped, and hunger soon started to take effect. Garrett and his men were fed sufficiently, and the smell of bacon wafted into the small rock house. It would seem that the kid and his gang had a few options: either try to escape and be shot dead, or surrender and enjoy a cooked meal. Of course, the kid wanted to stay in there as long as he could, but his men thought enough was enough, and their bellies were starting to rumble, and so they simply surrendered, and the kid followed. And despite the fact that the kid and his remaining men were now prisoners, the kid seemed in a light, cheerful mood, and very, very talkative, even though he was now chained up in irons and was most likely going to hang for his crimes. The day after Christmas, the kid and his gang were locked up in a Las Vegas jail. On his approach into the Las Vegas Plaza, the kid seemed to soak up the crowd that had formed, waving and joking, giving a cocky performance. Like I said before, he was somewhat of a celebrity now, and he seemed to enjoy it. That is, depending what mood you found him in. The stay in Las Vegas was very brief, and it wasn't long before Garrett and his prisoners sat on a train for Santa Fe. Whilst the train rested on a sidetrack, a posse arrived. They weren't there for the kid, but they were there for Dave Rudabar, the kid's accomplice, who apparently had killed a jailer a while back while springing a friend from prison. And the members of this posse had taken it very personally and wanted Dave Rudabar to face justice their way. But why stop at Dave Rudabar? Why not lynch all of the outlaws, which was a possibility? Garrett stepped out onto the platform as members of the posse went to board the train, as others went to stop the train from leaving. As the men approached, Garrett simply told them to stand down, and they actually did so. and surrounded the train car holding the outlaws. Meanwhile, the kid seemed totally unfazed by this as he hung out of the window of the train car, shouting if he had a Winchester, he would kill them all. And then he simply turned his attention to a reporter by the train and told his story. That is the story of his innocence, of course, whilst the mob closed in. Pat Garrett then warned the mob that if one of them was to make a move, he would happily give the outlaws weapons to fight back, and he would in turn fight by their side. The mob wasn't only stopping Pat Garrett from getting to his destination with his prisoners, they were also delaying the US mail. Defiantly, a postal inspector hit the throttle of the train and it was away, leaving the mob behind looking rather foolish, as Pat Garrett jumped back on board. The train would eventually arrive in Santa Fe and the kid was sent to jail to await his trial. Whilst in jail, the kid continued to write letters to Governor Wallace to remind him of the deal that was promised him but was not followed through. But as usual, the kid was ignored. He also reached out to lawyers for help, but with no means of payment, he was wasting his time. And so he turned his attention to simply escaping jail. And as we know, he was very good at escaping jails. He'd done it many times before. But this time, the chimney was not an option. So he tried to dig underneath the jail into the street. But the hole he was digging was discovered before the kid could slip away, resulting in more guards and more heavy chains. After these few failed escape attempts, the kid was getting desperate. And all he could do was write more letters to Governor Wallace, but once again, they were all ignored. The trial was coming fast, and the kid's future wasn't promising. And in the end, the kid was found guilty of murder and was sentenced. He was informed that he would be handed over to the sheriff of Lincoln County, where he would be confined to a jail cell until May the 13th. And on that day, he would be hanged from the neck until dead. On the 16th of April, the kid was sent back to Lincoln. The deputies feared another lynch mob, so they decided to announce that the kid would be transferred to Lincoln the following week, but instead simply slipped away from Masilla jail in the middle of the night. To prevent the kid from escaping, he was guarded by a marshal, a sheriff and 5 deputies who held guns on him at all times. And 3 of these men all had connections to the Dolan faction, the man responsible for Tunstall's murder. We had Billy Matthews, who actually led the posse that shot Tunstall dead and also shot the kid in the thigh during the slaying of Sheriff Brady. Then there was a cattle baron, John Kinney. And finally, we have Bob Ollinger, the US Marshal. Bob was another bully or torment to the kid, and he loved to antagonize him. And in the book, Billy the Kid, A Violent Life, Bob Ollinger is described as the following: 200 pounds of bones and muscles, 6 feet tall, round as a huge tree trunk, with a regular gorilla-like chest that bulged out so far his chin seemed to be set back in his chest. He had a heavy bull neck, low-browed head, short and wide, topped with shaggy hair, bushy eyebrows and a hat-rack moustache. His arms were long and muscular, with fists like hams. Despite his build and size, he was quick as a cat, and always got the best of the deal in any encounter he figured in. He could take punishment as well as hand it out. He loved to show off. It was one of his tricks to throw his .45s and keep a string of fire from both muzzles as long as the bullets lasted. Once the kid arrived back in Lincoln, it was decided that keeping him in a jailhouse was not a good idea, as he had become somewhat of an expert at escaping, as we now know. Instead, he would be placed in the county courthouse, which was actually the old Murphy and Dolan house. And Pat Garrett wasn't taking any chances. He was placed in a room on the 2nd floor in the northeast corner under constant guard. That included leg irons and handcuffs. And the 2 men that guarded him were Bob Ollinger and James Bell. They had been given the task of making sure that Billy didn't escape, something he was renowned for. Now, I've already told you about Bob Ollinger, who was a bit of a bully, but now let me tell you about James Bell. He was actually a very pleasant man, and he treated the kid with respect and decency. But when it came to Bob Ollinger, well, that was a different story. He would constantly antagonise and bully the kid. Bob may have been just a little too confident that the kid was no threat. But many in town warned him to never take his eye off the kid. And they warned him that no matter how much precautions were in place to prevent the kid's escape, if the kid saw a crack, he would slip through it. And on April the 28th, the kid saw his chance of freedom, and he took it. Now, Pat Garrett had actually left town to collect taxes, and the kid decided this was as good a time as any to make an escape attempt. Bob Ollinger had constantly been antagonising the kid, picking on him and intimidating him by loading his shotgun right in front of him while staring directly into his eyes, not breaking his gaze. And then Bob Ollinger said, "The man who gets one of these loads will feel it." Now, it wasn't only the kid Bob Ollinger and James Bell were in charge of, there were actually 5 other prisoners in different rooms. And at around 6 PM, Bob escorted the 5 men across the street to the Wortley Hotel for dinner, leaving the kid and Bell alone. If there was ever a good time to try and escape, this was it. The kid asked James Bell to take him to the privy out back as nature was calling, and James Bell obliged. On the way back from the privy, the kid ascended the staircase in front of James Bell, who was far too trustworthy. As the kid reached the top of the staircase, he rounded the corner out of sight and simply squeezed one hand out of the cuffs, something he knew he could do, but was waiting for the right time. Then he waited with one cuff still attached swinging by his side. As James Bell rounded the corner, the kid swung the chained cuff repeatedly at James Bell's head, which drew blood. James Bell fell down to the ground and the kid jumped on top of him, and they both fought for a while until the kid grabbed James Bell's gun. With that, James got to his feet and started to run down the stairs, ignoring the kid's order for him to stop, and so the kid, who was still on his stomach on the floor, took aim and shot James Bell, who then went crashing down the staircase. He got back to his feet, stumbled outside, and died. The kid would later remark that he did not want to kill James Bell. He wanted to capture him, not kill him. James Bell had been nothing but nice to the kid, and the kid actually liked him. But when James Bell ran, the kid said he had no choice but to shoot. He wasn't going to let anyone stand in the way of his escape. The kid then ran as best that he could with shackled legs to Pat Garrett's office and collected Bob Ollinger's shotgun, the same shotgun Bob had used to intimidate the kid. He then made his way to a window that looked out on the street below, and the kid positioned himself, placed the rifle on the windowsill, and took aim. Bob Ollinger had heard the gunfire and ran into the street from the Wortley Hotel. As he approached the courthouse, he looked up to see that the kid had him in his sights, and right there and then, he knew he was a dead man. The kid shouted, "Hello, Bob," and then he pulled the trigger and blasted Bob in the face and chest with the very shotgun that he loaded himself. Now, after killing Bob Ollinger, the kid didn't flee immediately. He actually stayed in town for around an hour longer, ordering the town people to help him break the chains of his shackles. No one attempted to stop him out of fear, as he warned them if anyone tried to stop him, he would simply shoot them dead. The kid also didn't allow anyone to get close to him, as he shouted orders to get him a horse ready and collect up as many guns as he could carry. The kid took Bob's rifle that he used to kill him and smashed it to pieces over the porch rail and threw it down on top of Bob's corpse. "Here's your gun, goddamn you. You won't follow me with it any longer," he shouted. As the kid made his way to the street, he passed James Bell's dead body and apologised, saying, "Sorry I had to kill you, but I couldn't help it." As he passed Bob Ollinger's body, however, he said, "You were not going to round me up again," and nudged the dead body with his boot. The kid then mounted his horse and rode out of town, and not one person stood in his way. After the kid's escape, the papers printed more of his exploits, further painting an image of a cold-blooded killer, which wasn't entirely untrue. After fleeing Lincoln, the kid bounced around for a while at homes of friends, never staying too long in one spot. The kid was advised by many to get far away from New Mexico as possible, but he didn't. He instead headed for one of his favourite haunts, Fort Sumner. Fort Sumner had always been a place he could find refuge, a place he was liked by most, especially the women. 9 days after escaping Lincoln, he arrived in Fort Sumner. Meanwhile, Pat Garrett was hot on his trail. His strategy was a little different this time. Instead of taking many men, he took only 2 men, John Poe and Thomas McKinney. His thinking was if he remained low profile, he could take the kid by surprise. And once again, Garrett had numerous spies who gave up the kid's location, but just riding into Fort Sumner wasn't the best move. The kid had too many friends who would hide him and lie for him as soon as they saw the law approach. But now, with a further $500 placed on the kid's head by Governor Wallace, it was getting harder to remain low profile. Garrett sent one of his men into Fort Sumner to try and figure out where the kid was staying. Garrett couldn't actually venture into Fort Sumner due to the kid knowing what he looked like. It became apparent that the mere mention of Billy the Kid made the locals nervous and agitated. They knew where the kid was, but out of fear or admiration, they would not give him up. And with that, Garrett and his men went into Fort Sumner under the cover of night. Now, Garrett was heading for the home of a Mr. Pete Maxwell, a rancher who actually found some regulators' work after the Lincoln County War and was actually friendly with the kid. However, Maxwell had grown to despise the kid because the kid had romantic relations with his sister, Paulita Maxwell, and was possibly the father of her unborn child. And Pete hated the fact that his sister may be carrying the child of an outlaw. And so he was in talks with Garrett to help him capture the kid, and he'd also told Garrett of the kid's presence in Fort Sumner. Garrett sneaked into Pete Maxwell's house in the middle of the night to see if he had any more information about the whereabouts of the kid. Unknown to Pat Garrett, the kid was actually indeed close by, and he was making his way to get himself some freshly slaughtered beef from Pete Maxwell's ranch. Whilst Garrett was questioning Pete Maxwell inside, the kid was approaching the building from the outside, totally unaware. The kid strolled up to the porch in bare feet, holding a butcher's knife in one hand and his pistol in the other. Outside Maxwell's porch stood Garrett's two men, Poe and McKinney, whilst Pat was inside talking with Pete Maxwell. The kid approached at a fast pace and came face to face with Poe. The kid panicked, jumped back and pointed his pistol and said, "Quienes?" The kid then backed up and repeated, "Quienes, quienes?" which was Spanish for "who is it?" Poe assured the kid he wasn't going to hurt him and not to be alarmed, as the kid backed into Pete Maxwell's doorway. Inside, Pete was just telling Garrett that the kid was hiding out nearby. At that moment, Garrett and Pete saw a silhouette of a man enter the room in the pitch darkness. The kid then said to Pete Maxwell, "Who are those fellows outside, Pete?" Maxwell whispered to Garrett, "That's him." The kid heard this and sprang back into a shooting stance and repeated, "Quienes?" With that, Garrett, who was sat at the end of the bed, pulled his pistol and fired 2 shots, lighting up the room for a split second. The first shot missed, but the second shot hit the figure in the chest, and he fell down with a groan, dead. Garrett and his men approached the body with a candle. As the light spilled onto the dead body, they could see it was the kid, still holding his pistol and his butcher's knife. Billy the Kid was dead, killed by Pat Garrett. Or was he? You see, that is the official story. That is what all the history books will tell you, that Pat Garrett killed Billy the Kid. But many believe that Garrett had shot the wrong man that night, although there was no doubting that Garrett knew exactly what the kid looked like. And it's safe to say that Garrett became famous from the killing of Billy the Kid, even releasing his own book detailing the chase and the killing, but would be branded a coward by some for shooting the kid who hesitated to shoot in the dark. The kid wasn't known for hesitation, but maybe he feared shooting a friend or Maxwell in the darkness, and Billy did indeed think Maxwell was his friend, and Garrett did shoot first, killing the kid. That is the official outcome. Billy the Kid was shot dead by Pat Garrett. However, Billy died in 1881, and in 1948 an elderly man came forward and confessed to being Billy the Kid, 67 years after Billy the Kid was shot dead. The elderly man went by the name of Brushy Bill Roberts, and he wanted the pardon that had been promised to him all those years ago. Brushy Bill filled in the missing years of Billy the Kid's story that seemed to fit in nicely, and he also showed off the ability to slip out of handcuffs. According to Brushy Bill, Garrett had actually shot the wrong man that night and had quickly buried the body so no one else could doubt him. And this is actually backed up by a few statements from Poe and Kinney, who were actually there that night. Initially, Poe told Garrett that he had shot the wrong man, but eventually Garrett had convinced the two men that he had indeed shot Billy the Kid, and the two men eventually agreed with him. That is actual historical fact. However, later on, apparently Kinney withdrew his statement, saying that he believed that the man Pat Garrett shot was not Billy the Kid. Also, there were other statements from other people who claimed that Pat Garrett had killed other men, believing it to be Billy the Kid on a few other occasions, and this actually included Charlie Bowdre, who he killed at the old rock house whilst he was getting grain for the horse, because he believed it was Billy the Kid. Unfortunately, we will never exactly know the truth because Brushy Bill died before any pardon was given or not given. During the autopsy, Brushy Bill Roberts' body was stripped, and it was found that he had 21 healed wounds made by bullets and knives. If Brushy Bill was Billy the Kid, unfortunately he took it to his grave. However, Brushy Bill Roberts' headstone does actually read William Henry Roberts, which was his real name, and underneath it reads, also known as Billy the Kid. So there are actually 2 gravestones out there that say Billy the Kid upon them. It was suggested that they could do DNA testings on Brushy Bill Roberts and the supposed corpse of Billy the Kid, but unfortunately the grave where Billy the Kid was buried has been flooded numerous times and the headstones had actually washed away, so it is unclear where exactly Billy the Kid is actually buried. But like I said, Brushy Bill Roberts does get a lot of attention and people actually do visit his gravesite to this day and place little mementos onto his grave in respect. And believe it or not, Brushy Bill Roberts was widely forgotten about until the release of Young Guns 2, which was released in 1990. And if you haven't seen that film, I highly recommend it. It is a very, very good Western. And the story of Brushy Bill Roberts is actually that popular that I believe they're thinking about making a Young Guns 3, which will explore the possibility of Billy the Kid actually surviving that night and going on to take the persona of Brushy Bill Roberts. I really hope that movie comes out. Let's keep our fingers crossed. So what do you think? Was Billy the Kid shot dead by Pat Garrett? Or did Pat Garrett shoot the wrong man? And Brushy Bill Roberts was actually Billy the Kid? As usual, I'll let you decide. Take care of yourselves and each other, and I'll see you next time.